Welcome to the Nightbird Radio Podcast. I'm Timothy Saylor, and I'm going to be your host this evening as we sound out the subconscious, navigate the nocturnal, and explore the farthest reaches of our experience, coming at you from the back of an 86 Dodge Ram van on the rolling foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, in the Great Forest, deep in the heart of the Kali Yuga. This is radio for the hauntological turn. This episode of the Nightbird Podcast was brought to you by yours truly. If you'd like to become a sponsor and hear your name read at the top of the show, head to nightbirdpodcast.com and navigate to the Support the Show page. Thank you so much for your generous support. And welcome back, Nightbirds. It's great to have you back, and it's great to be back. This week I was joined by Steven Snider, who goes by the handle Recluse. He's the co-author of the book Strange Tales of the Parapolitical, Postwar Nazis, Mercenaries, and Other Secret History, as well as the author of A Special Relationship, Trump, Epstein, and the Secret History of the Anglo-American Establishment. He's the writer and curator over at the VISUP blog, which can be found at visupview.blogspot.com, and he's also the host of the Farm Podcast. This episode was like going to conspiracy college. We talked about the mounds of North America, dousing for spirit contact, ley lines and the energy of place, haunted highways and weird routes, military behavioral control programs, Operation Paperclip, mind control in the American school system, Project Coast, David Lynch, theurgy, and so much more. He also shared with me about some of his upcoming projects that I'm really looking forward to. So without further introduction, let's get to the conversation. Steven Snider, welcome to the Nightbird Radio Podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing well, sir, and thank you for having me on.
Thanks for coming on. Do you want to just give a quick history of, your work in this area? Just for the audience or people that might not be familiar with you?
Sure. Well, I got into this back around 2010 or something like that, formally, when I launched the VISUP blog. And initially it was in conjunction with a paranormal, kind of thing that I was doing with one of my first partners out of the Daytona Beach area in Florida. So the VISUP actually stands for Volusia Investigative Society of Unexplained Phenomena. A little bit of trivia there for everyone.
Nice.
So anyway, this was back in the era, of course, like when ghost hunters and that kind of thing was all the rage. But I had never wanted to just kind of do a straight ghost hunting thing. I was always sort of more interested in a lot of 40 phenomena and that kind of thing, more so than just kind of conventional, let's go out and try to see if we can contact the dead person who crashed their car here or there or something like that. And frequently, this led to a lot of really interesting results too. I definitely found it was useful to ask really precise questions, like to some of these, whatever it was, you were supposedly talking to, because you would find out real quick that a lot of things they claimed to be the spirits of the dead were not, because they couldn't answer just basic questions about that person's life.
Interesting.
So,
that's cool to hear, man. I had no idea that was where that came from. Please continue. I love this.
Yeah. So we did that. Originally we had done just sort of like the paranormal thing. And then I had also been doing a lot of this research on my own into various topics. A lot of it was kind of more related around, some like the, behavior modification stuff, the remote viewing stuff, things like that. And I wanted to do some essays on a few of these things, like a couple of connections I was putting together. And also, the place, kind of what we would think was like a sacred geometry or something like that. Even back then, that was kind of something I was fascinated by. And even with the mounds, I've been around them a good chunk of my life. First, I was in West Virginia until I was about, 8 years old or something like that, when I was in third grade. And then I was in Florida in the Daytona Beach area until relatively recently, like I was in my mid 30s. But I lived in the area where the Tamaqua, I think, is probably butchering the pronunciation on that, but they were the one of the main tribes there around the time of colonial contact, and they were also a mound building civilization. But the mounds that they built were out of seashells, actually. Quite impressive. And there was a really massive one in New Smyrna Beach, which is a little south of Daytona, called it's Turtle Mound or something like that. So I kind of grown up in the backdrop of that, and then also some of the weird stuff in US 1, which sort of went through some of the old Tamaqua territories with the parks and what have you up there. Gosh, man, you would sometimes go like wandering back there, off of the trails and whatnot, and you would find some of the altars that they had left behind. And again, they were all like made out of seashells and stuff like that. I mean, the stuff was
wow.
Yeah.
You know what that also makes me think of is like the Coral Castle.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, did that guy have some kind of line on some this is just total speculation on my part. If anyone doesn't know about this, this is this guy that alone built these like monolithic castle out of the same kind of stone you're talking about, like seashell, coral, that's like the bedrock of Florida. But and he built this thing, and no one really ever saw him. Like I think a couple kids once saw him just working alone, but he had like a block and tackle. And when they asked him like, how did you do this? There's like multiple ton blocks. He's like he understood the secret of the pyramids or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's like a tangent, but that's interesting that's just what that made me think of. It's like, did that guy stumble on something? But anyway, continue.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is an interesting subject. Unfortunately, I was never able to see the Coral Gables before I left Florida. Of course, it's like pretty far south, almost down, I think, around like the Key West area, sort of like on the tip of the mainland, if I remember correctly. And it's not very fun to drive through the Miami area, to put it mildly. So that was always a bit of a deterrent, to put it mildly. But yeah, if I ever do go back to Florida, that would definitely be one of the things I would really very much like to see at some point. Interestingly, you kind of find if you travel around the country enough, there's different kind of structures like that across the nation. One is in Salt Lake City, Gilgal Gardens, I believe is the name off the top of my head. And it's kind of a similar setup. It's located actually like right in the middle of this, little suburb, and right off of like downtown Salt Lake City. So, I mean, it's not like even in the middle of nowhere or anything like that. And the story is that this guy basically built this whole just sort of park behind his house and this land, that's, right behind like all these multiple little suburbs and what have you. And he had this secret tunnel down into it from his root cellar that would bring him out into the area where the park was. And he built all of these huge, ritualistic structures down there, which has some really creepy stuff on it, I should add. And
nice. I'm gonna have to check that out.
Yeah. And he did it all, and he apparently started it too, like when he was in his mid-50s. I mean, and then continued to build it over the course of the next 30 years. So you're basically left with this notion that this man, like in his 70s, early 80s, was still crafting these elaborate stone and marble structures behind his suburban house, with a lot of his neighbors being none the wiser. So yeah, you find a lot of that kind of stuff. It's one of the things that makes America just, in a lot of these kind of off the beaten path type attractions like that, so fascinating. But anyway, yeah, getting back to like my story. So, I'd had all this sort of other stuff I was researching, and I had started putting the essays up on the blog that I had started VISUP originally to kind of promote the paranormal investigations that we were doing. But gradually, I mean, it became much more about just doing the articles. I kind of built up a following with that. And from fairly early on, I had really been inspired by a lot of the synchro-mystical movement, of course. I mean, I would say Chris Knowles was probably by far the biggest influence, along with, was it rigorous intuition, I think, or I always forget the second part of it. The website on the blog that Jeff Wells ran for many years that was just fantastic. But yeah, and also the forum is still quite interesting as well, with a lot of great discussion on it. But those were sort of like the major influences I had going in when I started VISUP, and I had always wanted it to kind of be this cross between, a lot of these kind of parapolitical topics on the one hand, and then this, what I guess, more exopolitics or just high strangeness, all that other kind of stuff like on the side. And just sort of gradually, I think I kind of found my own sort of niche, my own voice as I grew out of the synchro-mystical movement, even though that's kind of still where I trace my origins back to, and I still feel like a lot of kinship with it. I mean, I kind of just do my own thing, I guess, now.
Very cool. So, yeah. So what, I had this question just while you were talking. What methods were you using to talk to these? You mentioned like asking these spirits about, presumably dead people that you found may not actually be who they claim to be. What kind of methods were you using to do that?
Ironically, typically dowsing rods.
Yeah.
I found, there's, that's one of those things, like you always would think of dowsing rods as being rather ridiculous, but I've found them to be actually quite effective, at least, back in the day. I mean, for this kind of stuff. I mean, this is before, of course, you could easily get stuff like the spirit box and things like that. So,
yeah, see, those things are even like more trickstery to me, I feel like. Like there's something going on, like, just being in the I was in the presence of someone that was doing the Estes method once, and it just like it was super eerie. It was in the middle of the woods too. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot that adds up in those situations that could like have affected, but like my intuition with it was like, this is something else,
Yeah.
Like we're not necessarily talking to like to a person. Well, a person, maybe a non-human person, right? But like dowsing rods, that actually makes sense to me. I think that's a pretty, like, in my opinion, like, I know some people might find that kind of woo, but I feel like that's a pretty tried and true.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the core of dowsing rods, I mean, it really is related to the metals. Of course, we had made our own dowsing rods out of copper that we had found, in like, a lot of old coat hangers and stuff we've gone out and like looked for. But it's really important that you have like specific kinds of metals for it, because I mean, again, I think when it comes to a lot of these kinds of communications, it's really based on like different kinds of energies that we don't totally understand. But I mean, certain metals can be used, as a method of communication through this. And I mean, I do think there's something to be said for like, high frequency radio or low frequency radio waves, things like that of that nature as well. So when you do sort of take this kind of electrical perspective of it, quote unquote, but definitely, I mean, I think copper is a major issue with that, or is a good conduit for this type of stuff, particularly the general notion that consciousness is sort of derived from like an energy field that surrounds the physical body, if you will. So. And I mean, I kind of think too that kind of contributes, or at least it's a factor as to why like places are such a, a big factor as well, and the amount of like maybe paranormal activities or things of that nature. Because I mean, again, when you look at things like ley lines and those kinds of concepts, I mean, I suspect that, this tradition grew out of telluric currents, things of that nature. Of course, this is, the method that we used for telegrams, telegraph system back in the day. So, I mean, it was already known as, an effective means of communication with that, and natural means through the energies that flow through the earth, these telluric currents. But I suspect that was probably the basis, for ley lines on what the ancients were looking at back in the day. So, to my mind, it stands to reason that certain areas that these currents travel along, especially when there's intersections, crossroads, that kind of thing, would probably be, most constructive to, these different kinds of conscious energies and things of that nature gathering there. So, I think that's one of the reasons why, like, the building of places was so important to so many ancient civilizations in general.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it makes me think of, so around here we have and it's just like, maybe like an hour and a half south of me, Rock Eagle and Rock Hawk. And those are in Putnam County, Georgia. And they're bird effigies that are they're on kind of a raised mound, and they are made of like hundreds and hundreds of pieces of quartzite rock. And like the ground here is just full of that. It's like very high quartz content, and then Atlanta is on just like a big ass piece of granite. But like,
yeah, quartz seems to be something that turns up like in a lot of these areas too. I mean, I also think that the kind of mineral and like metal deposits are like another factor. So it's like I was saying, earlier. I mean, it seems like certain substances are also better conduits for these kinds of energies.
Right, and they kind of these power places seem to constantly be located on or near them. But I mean, if you go to these places, they're buzzing. They're like alive, right? And then there are some mound sites that are like, you can tell it's more of, this was maybe a village or something like that. Like, and I'm just going from my own experience of like just kind of feeling it out. And of course, the excavations will bear it out too. But the Etowah mounds a little bit north of here, that seems more like, like, okay, yeah, like people lived here. But these sites are like, I think Rock Eagle and Rock Hawk, they're older than most of the other mound complexes. So they're like from even before, and I can't give you a precise like year range, but and then I'm also kind of one of those people that thinks that like all the timing is probably pretty off. Like I'd definitely take a more Graham Hancock timetable on that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they're like, and what's interesting to me about that is, and I don't know, man, maybe it's just from reading the Peter Levenda stuff, but it's interesting because like one of the oldest insane asylums, or like one of the it was, when it was open, it was one of the largest insane asylums, and I think maybe the largest in the world is Central State, and it's like right there. And then so Rock Eagle and Rock,
near a mound complex, you're saying?
Yeah, well, it's near the Rock Eagle complex. Yeah, it's not like right on it, and then the Rock Hawk, which is kind of on the other side of this river from Rock Eagle, it is owned by Georgia Power, and it just really, it seems like you said, like those currents, those ley lines, like is that a coincidence that those things are always built on those, in those areas? What do you think about that? Like, what is your
No, because I mean, I've noticed a lot of that. I mean, obviously, with in West Virginia, one of the largest surviving mound complexes in the state is in Moundsville, West Virginia. It's an Adena Mound there, Grave Creek Mound. It's enormous. It's like nearly 60 feet high, I believe. And in this case, like literally directly across the street, there was this enormous Gothic prison. I mean, it really looks like a castle or something like that, honestly. I mean, it's closed down now, but for many years it was the major, I believe, state penitentiary in West Virginia. And more importantly, it was where most of the state's executions were performed for many, many years. And this prison has subsequently become, kind of infamous in its own right. Of course, it's supposedly one of the most haunted places in Appalachia on the one hand. So it's appeared in a lot of like ghost hunting shows, but then sort of curiously, more recently, it was used in, I think it was the TV show Castle Rock as a stand-in for Shawshank Prison, which, you know, everybody knows from Shawshank Redemption, the famous movie there. So it's kind of fascinating how it's entered the popular consciousness that way as well. But I mean, yeah, it's right across the street, literally from Grave Creek Mound. And I've noticed this again in Ohio, in Chillicothe. You know, not too far outside of there, there's a huge Hopewell complex called Mound City. And in this case, there's not one, but there's two prisons. One that's like directly beside of the Mound complex. It's a huge prison complex. And then directly across the street from it, there's another huge prison complex.
Wow.
And I believe at least one of the, because if I'm not mistaken, the mounds in the Mound City complex aren't the original ones. They were basically reconstructions of the original structures. They had,
yeah, I think that happens a lot too.
yeah, if I'm not mistaken, I think they had torn them down to build the one prison that's directly beside of the site. So that prison is actually made out of the remnants of the original structure there. So it's very odd.
Yeah, that's just asking for it, man.
Yeah.
And that's why it's like, man, I just can't see coincidence there. Like, I see that kind of hand of something.
Yeah.
Even if it's like a current, you know?
And then I'm about to do a show with one of my mates in the Michigan area, which we're going to get into some of the mounds out there. And I mean, what he was telling me, it's kind of a similar thing where they build like a lot of landfills and stuff like that near these sites. So yeah, it does seem like that's a reoccurring theme throughout the nation, is that a lot of these, you know, ancient megalithic structures, you usually see a lot of odd things like placed near them. And I think in a lot of cases, stuff that's meant to sort of desecrate or, you know, I mean, I don't know, even mock in a sense the energy from these Native American sites. And this is why, you know, you're putting like prisons and, you know, landfills and stuff like that next to them. I mean, it's just, you know, I mean, absolutely sacrilege of the highest order in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. It's profane. Yeah. So speaking of the prison thing, so in this same area as and I think these were these mounds in particular are the woodland peoples, I think is what they call them. I'm not sure if they've changed that.
Oh, is it the Eastern, you're talking in Georgia there?
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. The Eastern Woodland Tribes. Yeah, I think that was kind of like the original sort of culture for at least a lot of the Native American tribes, going back to around like you know, the late BCs, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. And so really, really fascinating. But oh yeah, what I was saying is there are like, at one point, I think they've closed some of them, but at one point there were a total of 7 prisons. And this whole area, it's like, I lived there for like 12 years. It's like a vortex.
Yeah,
It just has that thing going on.
I mean, also too, the Atlanta prison is just absolutely infamous. I mean, I can remember back from my profane youth, man, I would hear some stories about the Atlanta prison from people I was let's just say detained with. And yeah, I mean, it was, people tell me like that you would literally, there were accounts of people literally committing suicide rather than going into the Atlanta prison. It was so bad.
Yeah, I could imagine. That place is just, it's so it's imposing looking. I mean, they always are, right? You know, they're built like these kind of like, always looks like a dark fortress, which is like what it is.
Yeah. Well, like, in the case I know of the Moundsville prison that's right in West Virginia next to Grave Creek Mound, I mean, they even said specifically that it was built with the intention of being like the most sinister, imposing, like kind of architecture that they could think of. That's why they did it in this really elaborate Gothic revival style, because they really wanted people terrified of it, just looking at it.
That's an interesting point too, okay? Because so part of it to me seems like it is almost like this the ritual of power itself, like the ritual involved in creating this this idea of a monolithic power, like that's kind of plays into that, because you know really, like, they don't have any there's no power but what the people, well, or so they say, right? There's no power but what the people are willing to like give to them. And I'm just speaking as them, as like, powers that be or whatever. We can be talking about, the government, whatever. But I think it's kind of in general across the board, right? That you have to convince the people in some way, shape, or form that you are legitimate, that you are the force to be reckoned with, right? And that's kind of part of that trappings of power. I feel like maybe that's part of it.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. Well, you got to have legitimacy to rule. I mean, that's one of the major things.
Yeah, it's sort of, it really is. It's like a Wizard of Oz thing. It's kind of creating that illusion, because in the end, it is kind of an illusion too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, again, that's why I mean ritual drama is such like a big part of all this as well.
Right, right.
um, but yeah, I mean, it's another kind of interesting thing I've been looking at recently in regards to like a lot of the sort of places of power too, or the highway systems, especially like the early U.S. routes before the interstate system, the kind of transnational highways. You've got a really interesting one out there in Atlanta that goes through at US Route 23, which starts in Jacksonville and runs all the way up to Michigan. But I've been looking at that one a lot lately because, I mean, it's got so much crazy stuff on it and unfolding, of course, along it as well. But I mean, obviously, besides the kind of connections that it has to Atlanta there, and then also Jacksonville, which, I mean, it has a storied history. It's also a major military hub. In fact, I think it has like one of the largest military presence in the entire Eastern Seaboard. And then, getting outside of Georgia, it goes into North Carolina. And one of the really interesting places it goes by is Asheville, North Carolina, which is where the Biltmore Mansion is located. And this was built by the Vanderbilts. And there's also another really interesting structure there, too. I think it's like the Asheville Tower or something like that. It was another really elaborate mansion that was put in by another wealthy family. And it's fascinating because, again, Asheville, North Carolina, it's in the middle of nowhere. And they really build these intricate structures there. And of course, there's been a lot of rumors for years of some kind of like satanic cult that's active in that whole region, that kind of thing. I went to the Biltmore when I was really young, so I don't remember much of it. But I mean, certainly going back and looking at some of the imagery I've been able to find of it, I mean, it's definitely an imposing structure with a lot of esoteric markings and what have you all around it. I know there was also a lot of rumors that there were like underground tunnels and stuff in that whole area too. So it's just fascinating that, I mean, they built almost this, I mean, almost modern kind of quasi shrine out there in the middle of nowhere. And then, of course, you continue further north. It goes into Ashland, Kentucky, which, again, is another interesting area. It's sort of like
definitely like a hub, right?
Yeah, it's another area with
of
a lot
weird
of mountains and stuff. Yeah. A lot of serial killers came from like around this area. It was also sort of right around the region, I believe, where the Hatfield-McCoy dispute played out. And of course, across the border into West Virginia, that's like a big, kind of primo like Mothman area. So Ashland is another like really weird spot. That's one of the areas actually Peter Levenda writes about in Sinister Forces specifically.
Right.
And then, you go up from there into Ohio and 23. It goes right through most of the major mound complexes in the southern part of the state. Serpent Mound, Mound City, which I was just talking about, a couple of the other ones. And it's also in this region specifically known as a major hub of like human trafficking, drug trafficking, specifically on US 23 there, to the point that, there's actually an interstate task force that was founded to try to tackle all of the just litany of crime that was unfolding along the highway. Of course, it goes up through into Columbia, Ohio, which, that's where Lex Wessner was. That's where Jeffrey Epstein was. Or I think Lex Wessner still is in that area. Jeffrey Epstein was there for some time. So there's a lot of that kind of sketchy stuff as well. And then finally, you go up into Michigan, and again, there's a huge litany of human and drug trafficking in Ann Arbor and Flint, which are two of the main cities that it goes through there. And there's also a lot of mound complexes and stuff like that along this whole area as well. Like I said, I'm getting ready to do a show on kind of this whole significance of that area in Michigan soon. So, yeah, it's just, I mean, absolutely fascinating to me that, you see this one particular highway. And then, of course, the number 23 as well, I mean, has a lot of esoteric significance. And this isn't the only case, too, where I've noticed like a Highway 23 having weird stuff. Like Wisconsin has like a Highway 23, for instance. It's not connected to this at all, but this is the road that House on the Rock is off of, which was really popularized by Neil Gaiman and American Gods. It's where the whole carousel thing is and all that stuff is at. And then about 7 miles up the road is Taliesin, which was Frank Lloyd Wright's studio / residence for a lot of years. It's another weird structure. So, you kind of see like these 23s and these highways across the country that have like a lot of these weird things that are set up on them. And, my understanding is this, is not the only instance of this. Of course, one of the really famous examples would be the old U.S. Route 66, which passed through a lot of like the American Southwest. And it's interesting too, because it was kind of, in the case of US 23, I mean, it was despairingly dubbed in some areas the Hillbilly Highway, because it was the route a lot of people from Appalachia took out of Appalachia into the Midwest and Ohio and Michigan, and from there, like other places like Illinois and so forth, to work in the factories. And it was kind of like the same thing with U.S. Route 66, which was, what really took a lot of people back in the early days of the highway systems, from the Northeast and the Midwest out into the West itself proper. So, I'm really fascinated by this notion, especially with the early highway systems, like how much that they were also sort of constructed along these sort of telluric currents or ley lines, whatever you want to call them. And also just, the places that have been built along them, because I mean, part of me feels like the Biltmore, for instance, was always intended to be a kind of, almost tourist attraction out there, gathering sort of energy from all the visitors and so forth.
Oh, yeah, interesting.
I mean, you see that obviously with places like House on the Rock and what have you. But, this is, kind of a concept I'm borrowing from Neil Gaiman. But I mean,
but I think he really hits on something in that book.
Yeah. And I mean, very much that, I mean, these sort of roadside attractions and stuff, these really are like the true, American shrines and temples. I mean,
and they're way stations too, right? Which gives them like a Mercury kind of connection, a hermetic kind of vibe to them as well, right? Like, I mean, I don't think that we're the only ones that take these roads.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just the fact that they're able to draw these people, I mean, especially like with House on the Rock or the Biltmore, I mean, these are attractions that were built in fairly like out of the way places. Like I was saying, there's not really anything out near these areas. So, I mean, the fact that they're able to get so many people to travel out there in the first place is pretty remarkable in and of itself. I mean, you can point to other examples like the Rosicrucian, Museum and Park in San Jose, California. I mean, that's a lovely spot too. But again, it's in San Jose. It's right out there in the midst of San Francisco and Palo Alto and all this other stuff. So, I mean, that's not really a difficult area to get to. But I mean, some of these other regions, though, these other places, it's just kind of fascinating that they build up these, what have subsequently become almost these Field of Dream-esque, attractions to people in the middle of nowhere, and how they've managed to work and have that energy to pull people into these desolate areas.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at. For one thing, I think it's funny that I didn't even think about this when I wore this hat, but wearing a Route 66.
Oh, yeah, I hadn't even noticed that either, actually. That's, good judgment.
Yeah, kind of funny. But the way that the old like Route 66, 23, interesting enough, there's one going through the area I was talking about with the Rock Eagle Mound and all those prisons in the insane asylum, 441. that Tom Petty actually mentions in American Girl, I think. Could hear the cars go by out on 441 like waves crashing on the beach. Anyway,
Yeah,
just a
yeah,
little bit
yeah.
of trivia because I'm
There's
partial
the
to the
Dixie
area.
Highway. That's like another one. I think that's what
Yeah,
year, 21 or something. But yeah,
well, yeah, and so when I lived there, there was a lot of talk of like, yeah, the bikers would come up from Florida, like bringing all the cocaine and stuff through. And so there was, there's all that same kind of idea going on to what you're talking about. But the way that those highways are laid out are kind of like the way that they flow with the land. They kind of, and I'm going to be searching for the right words to say when I'm describing this, but they kind of flow with the land as opposed to just like flowing over it and like bulldozing anything in their way, right? So like the more modern highways, they just like clear cut through.
yeah, yeah. I know what you're saying. Like, yeah, like I mean, you see that a lot in West Virginia, where they're like cut almost into like the side of mountains and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
it's almost like to flow with the currents of energy, kind of like what you're saying, right? Like, and then
Yeah,
the more modern highways just seem there to like just put a fucking wall, maybe even doing the opposite and like acting as a like a breaker.
yeah. No, it's another interesting one in that regard too that I was just now it occurred to me was one from again the area where I grew up in Florida. This was parts of it are now part of like US Route 1. And it's also called the Dixie Highway, but this wasn't the Interstate Dixie Highway. This was like the really early one. But this road is actually like one of the oldest in the entire country. It was originally constructed by the Spanish to link New Smyrna with St. Augustine, and those are, I think, like the first and third oldest cities in Florida. And there's I don't know, it's probably about 100 miles between them, maybe not quite that. I mean, it's not super far, but it's not short either. But New Smyrna had a really kind of a tragic history. It was basically founded as kind of a plantation by this guy called Turnbull. He built his mansion on top of one of the main Tamaulipas mounds, actually, like right in the middle of the downtown area of the city.
Yeah, bad idea, man.
Yeah. Well, pretty much all of the residents were indentured servants, effectively, who have been brought in from like Greece and places like that. And it went on for about 10 years. And gosh, I think Turnbull had brought like 2,000 of them or something like that over initially. And within 10 years, only about 500 people were left. I mean, they had literally been worked to death on this site. And after the British had taken possession of Florida after one of the litany of European wars, where these kind of territories were swapped out like baseball cards,
right?
Basically they had all deserted the plantation and walked up this highway like in mass up to St. Augustine to petition the British authorities for their rights, essentially arguing that they had been kept against their will past their indentured contracts and all this other stuff, and reported the abuses. But it had obviously so that kind of like peculiar history with it, and then also, I mean, some of the things with the Tamaulipas as well. So I mean, there's a lot of reports of just paranormal activity and stuff like that all along this highway. Especially, when you kind of get into the, more rural areas. I mean, the parts of it connecting, New Smyrna into the Daytona area. And then when you get out of Daytona, like around Ormond and stuff, especially going up into St. Augustine, that's where most of it is, I mean, almost totally unchanged from colonial times. And I mean, there's just, lots of interesting energies up there. And I mean, it's attracted some negative stuff as well. This is also where there's a lot of, well, I haven't been there in a couple of years now, so I don't know if it's still the case, but this is where, like, traditionally a lot of the kind of more hardcore, like biker bars and what have you were, because I mean, it was outside of Daytona proper. And this was also kind of the area where Arlene Warhol's used to sort of roam around to during her heyday. So there was a lot of stuff with the outlaws and some other weird stuff going on out in the area too back then. So yeah, it's just again, it's another example of just some of the fascinating history of some of these old highways, and it definitely makes you wonder about how they were constructed, and specifically, is it a coincidence that they keep drawing all these kinds of energies to them? Which I really don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I'm actually pretty like on the on the spectrum of my opinion about coincidences. I kind of don't even really think that they're a thing. Like, I think that there are coincidences, like things that happen at the same time, but I think that essentially makes them connected somehow, right? Because they occur at the same time.
Yeah. Which,
Like,
I mean, it's interesting too, because Atlanta has such a rich esoteric history too. What was it? The one occultist there, Percy Randolph or something like that. He had one of like the earliest systems of sex magic, if I'm not mistaken.
oh, interesting. I don't know anything about him. I might have to check that out.
Yeah. So, I mean, Atlanta had that kind of like interesting tradition as
I mean,
well.
it definitely has a vibe still, Um, but yeah, I'll have to check that out. And like Oakland Cemetery has that. It just that just real gothic Victorian garden feel to it. Like, I don't know. Atlanta has definitely like just some energy all its own.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly it's had a lot of dark stuff there too with the Atlanta
Definitely.
child killings, and I mean,
Yeah.
I've heard to this day still a pretty big hub for trafficking and what have you.
I'm sure because it's just a big hub in the area in general, right? So like that stuff's gonna, like you said, flow on these highways. Nightbirds. I hope you've been enjoying the conversation so far, and there's more to come. But first, I have to ask that you support the show. As I'm sure you've noticed, there are no commercials on this show. There are no paywalls. You get everything up front. For there to be free dialogue here, I think it must remain uncaged by the interests of advertisers. But Nightbird Radio does cost time and money to make, and your support means I can spend less time delivering pizza and more time doing this. That's a win-win. So that's why Nightbird Radio is a value for value podcast. I hope you found value in this show, but I can't and won't dictate just how much. Only you can decide that. But what I can do is invite you to take that value, turn it into a number, and head to www.nightbirdpodcast.com and hit the donate button located on the front page to offer your support. We're also listed on podcastindex.org, which means you are able to send Bitcoin via the Lightning Network using your favorite Podcasting 2.0 apps, which can be found at newpodcastapps.com. And finally, I also accept dry goods. Email me at tim@nightbirdpodcast.com for more information. Sponsors will get a special mention on the show. Thank you for your generous support. Now let's get back to the conversation. Maybe this is a little bit of a change of subject, but I think it's definitely tangential. I wanted to talk a little bit about MK Ultra. I know that's a big can of worms, you know. But I wanted to talk about, in particular, what you think the purpose of that was. So I have this, and I'll preface it by giving my little pet theory, right? Or at least about what's going on with it now. Maybe this may not answer, the fundamental question of it, but I don't think it ever ended. I just think that they took it to scale, and that like we live in it now. You know what I mean? Like they burned all the stuff and was like, yeah, we didn't find anything. You know, and yet here we have like widespread use of pharmaceuticals. It's like everyone's being experimented on 100% of the time. I know you've mentioned this on some other podcasts I've heard you on, but like the talented and gifted programs, I think totally are from that. So yeah, could you go into that a little bit on what your kind of thoughts or what do you think about it's a very loaded question. What do you think about all that?
Well, I mean, in the case of something like the gifted program, I mean, that really had nothing to do with MK Ultra. I mean, that was derived more from a military thing called Army Alpha program, which was what was used as sort of the model for the gifted program. And this goes all the way back to the First World War, for that matter.
Oh, interesting.
And I should probably point out, I mean, that's like one of the major misconceptions. Like MK Ultra was really only one of like several projects that were kind of ongoing with a lot of this stuff. And I mean, a lot of it was actually controlled by the military more so than the CIA, which a lot of people don't realize.
Okay, so MK Ultra just kind of gets used as a blanket term.
Yeah, well, I mean, I
that's what
also
I've done in
think
this case.
well, I think it also, though, tries to deflect a lot of blame from the military itself, and also to cover up the scope of like all of the stuff that the military was doing.
Interesting.
Because, okay, when you get into this, it's obviously it's a really complicated subject. But the origins of a lot of this stuff sort of went back actually to the period between the First and the Second World War. And this is when a lot of the research that initially was begun during the First World War was kind of taken up and sponsored by, you know, the Rockefeller Foundation and some of these other groups. And it really built up what we would think of today as like the life sciences on the one hand, which includes like neuroscience, and also would have involved like the study, or at the time, the search for what we would think of now as genetics. Of course, we didn't really discover that, I think, until the late 40s, early 50s. And then on the other hand, like the social sciences and things of that nature. And then going into the Second World War, a lot of this research was taken up further by the military, and especially the U.S. Navy, and to a much lesser extent, the OSS. But a lot of it was, directed under the National Defense Committee Council or something like that. It was the one that Vannevar Bush oversaw. And, you had Division 19 and a lot of other crazy stuff that was going on there. The actual origins, for example, of like the psychotronic program that we've been doing, derived from this, which nobody ever talks about. It came out of the RAD lab, actually, specifically the Radio Research Laboratory, which Frederick Terman oversaw. He's an interesting guy. His dad, Louis Terman, was the one who created the gifted program. And Frederick Terman is essentially the one that built up Silicon Valley and Stanford and SRI as the powerhouses that they are today. But going back to when he was at the Radio Research Lab during World War II, working for the Navy, I mean, this is when we started looking at high frequency radio waves and the effects that they could have on things like the ionosphere, on the effects that they would have on human beings. I mean, I was recently at Stanford, and I, got photocopies of a lot of these documents. I mean, going back to the early to mid 40s, they're talking about shooting, ultra high radio waves into the ionosphere just to see what it would do. They're talking about, using electro beam rays to interfere with the human mind, essentially, in some of these documents. And then on top of that, you have the fact that Terman was the guy in the post-war years who built Stanford up. He established things like the Stanford Microwave Lab, which again is another major component of psychotronic or non-lethal weapons. And also the fact that almost all of this was sponsored by the U.S. Navy. I mean, a lot of people don't realize this, but I mean, up through the 50s and 60s, I think something like 60 to 70% of Stanford's funding was coming from the freaking Navy. And Frederick Terman was the point man for all of this. He was the provost for Stanford during a lot of this time. So, this is like a huge component of this kind of research that was almost entirely under the direction of the Navy, specifically, that was going on at Stanford. And this sort of bled into a lot of other things that were being carried out there. I mean, another interesting series of programs that were kind of connected to this, and the ARPANET research that DARPA was doing, or back then it was called ARPA, obviously, was a lot of the stuff that was related to counterinsurgency, things like Project Camelot and Project Cambridge. These were probably programs that Edward Lansdale had initiated when he was overseeing what was effectively the Joint Special Operations Command, sort of proto version of it in the Kennedy White House. He had this guy, William Goodell, who was reporting to him, basically overseeing the counterinsurgency program in ARPA. They started setting up, well, on the one hand, I mean, kind of the genesis of the Phoenix program originated from this network. But on top of that, they set up these, effectively computer laboratories, in Vietnam to compile data or to feed data that they were compiling into to come up with computer models and how the strategic Hamlet programs that they had set up and things like that were doing eventually to try to get models for how the Viet Cong would react. And gradually, they started building up a lot of these computer models for other militaries and then, again, eventually our own citizenry. So this is sort of the beginning of the technology that later would come to fruition with things like Cambridge Analytica and so forth. I mean, this was also being built up by ARPA in the 1960s and has subsequently become a significant part of behavior modification and control when you look at how much computers and internet are now used for that type of thing. So this is like what I like to think of as the hard side of this kind of work. It was really centered in a lot of very hard sciences and that kind of thing. When you get into stuff like MK Ultra, which was the CIA program, and Project Artichoke, which was a joint CIA military program and was never rolled into MK Ultra as is commonly claimed, and continued concurrently with MK Ultra all the way up until the early 70s when both of them were broken up and folded into other programs separately. But anyway, the purpose of these programs, I think, was frankly to research on a lot of these more esoteric kind of tropes, basically, for lack of a better term, to see if a lot of occultism and magic had a basis in reality and could it be used for military or national security purposes, or, to explore it for other purposes as yet acknowledged to the general public. Because again, this is, I know that sounds kind of insane, but ultimately, when you look at the staggering number of times that the military and the CIA dosed people with LSD or BZ and what have you. Like, you don't have to do this thousands of times on the scale that they were doing,
right?
To find out that it was unreliable, for mind control purposes or whatever. Really, if you want to control a society, opiates are much better for that. Which
100%.
Since like the 17th or 18th century. And that's, again, why you see opiates now everywhere, but that's another topic.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like the same thing also with remote viewing, which grew out of a lot of this kind of research. Once again, they figured out pretty early in the game that this kind of stuff wasn't, super practical for spying purposes. There was something to it most likely, but whether or not it could be reliably used consistently for intelligence gathering or other purposes, it was never something that anybody was sold on. So why then do you continue to research it by the military and the intelligence services? For decades, if you realize in the early 70s that it wouldn't be practical for this kind of stuff.
Right, but that almost gives it an even more sinister.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cast.
It does raise even more curious questions about like why the military and the intelligence community were so interested in continuing to push like a lot of these programs with just this, really kind of far out stuff with hallucinogens and ESP. And also, there was even some research done into things like UFOs and the case of some of these programs, and really odd ones too, like the Kentucky Hobgoblin incident and things like that.
Yeah, I love that. I love that case.
So, it definitely, Jungian psychology was another thing they looked at. It definitely, I think, raises to my mind that this was being done to really, investigate. Some of these bigger, paranormal or, occultic topics in a very scientific, or at least as much as possible as for these kinds of subjects way. But again, for what purpose? I don't really know. But I definitely question the official narrative that it was for behavioral or mind control. I mean, certainly it would seem that in the grand scheme of things, a lot of the stuff that the harder approach was being done with computer modeling and psychotronics and what have you, has proven to be far more effective than just, trying to dose people with LSD or something like that. I mean, I think there was another purpose entirely to that.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So in the same way that some of those hard approaches that you're talking about are more effective at mind control, there are other ways that are much more effective in contacting beings. So that almost is like, that almost brings me to the same logical conclusion, though. Like, okay, so you know what I mean? Like, you also don't have to take acid like over and over again to like get in contact with that stuff. So why, like,
Well, that is kind of the
why?
interesting thing about that, because again, there is one of the things that does seem to have come out of a lot of this kind of research is that there is a reoccurring theme of people being contacted by non-human intelligences in these kind of altered states of consciousness. Obviously one of the real famous examples of psychedelic research that was semi-legitimate was done by Rick Strassman on DMT, and I think it was like the University of Arizona or Phoenix or something like that in the 90s. And a lot of people who were test subjects in that reported seeing, things that resembled kind of gray aliens in these states that contacted them. I think these would be kind of akin to Terence McKenna's mechanical elves or something like that. Mm. And then conversely, with the remote viewing program, a lot of the remote viewers, when they were in their states, doing their viewings, also reported seeing, extra what they would, describe as extraterrestrial beings, gray aliens in these states. But again, they weren't using drugs or psychedelics, but it was a similar situation. So,
yeah, if you can contact an entity with a coat hanger,
mm-hmm.
it makes me wonder. You'd think with all the money they're pouring into that, they would realize that. I don't know. Like, it's just really...
I kind of think that, that's what they were sort of looking at with that, because again, the whole process with remote viewing is, pretty simple. It's not like, it was like
right.
Clever,
it's actually like way more simple than it's ever made out to be. It's quite like just take your first impression, like from what I've done of it, and because I've done a little bit of it.
I don't think that it was necessarily like, I think they were just basically trying to explore whether or not that they could, get consistent results with a lot of these different methods.
Oh, yeah. That makes sense.
That was like really the major issue, I think, with a lot of this stuff. Also to try to understand, like what they were being told. Whether it's legitimate or not, whether they were being tricked. That kind of gets into the whole Collins elite notion and that kind of thing. So,
yeah, to try to, like maybe to get a leg up on these beings.
Yeah, but again, as insane as this might sound, it just kind of seems like that this was the most practical explanation that I've come across for a lot of these programs.
No, and I think you're right. And it honestly doesn't sound crazy to me. This is a podcast where we go there. So it's not...
because again, as I've kind of elaborated, there were a lot of other programs that you never hear about that were being run for these purposes of behavior modification and mind control that were using way more scientific methods than just, massively dosing people with LSD over and over again,
Right. Because it seems like that person actually becomes really difficult to control, which I think is probably, we saw some of the effects of that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, there was, I think, definitely an ulterior purpose to Artichoke and MK Ultra that, a lot of people, I think, are still kind of, just gradually starting to accept. And it really, was not related to what we would conventionally think of as national security purposes.
Right. Yeah. At least not in any direct sort of way. I'm sure they justified it a lot of ways, you know, not that they have to. Well, that kind of gets me thinking too about, and you know, you obviously know more about this than I do, so maybe you can set me straight on it. But from my understanding, I want to talk a little bit about paperclip. And I think, you know, usually the common thought about that is that, like, oh, yeah, we took their scientists, but we also took their intelligence apparatus, right?
Yeah, parts of it. With
Parts of it, right? Yeah, we shared it with Russia or what have you. But like, you go ahead and talk about that because I want to hear what your take on that is.
Well, like what specifically? Like the influence?
Well, yeah, the influence that they had. It's hard for me not to see a through line between what people like Mangala were doing and what we ended up doing. And now maybe that's just because, you know, just corruption in the halls of power, right? And there is that like Faustian archetype that seems to come up again and again when these researchers or whatever you want to call them are given like infinite funding and no barriers to what they can try to do. So is it that, or is there a through line there?
Well, I mean, I definitely think there is because, again, a lot of the, the Nazi eugenicists and what have you were inspired, I think, by a lot of the stuff that we were already doing over here in the United States. I mean, kind of getting into the gifted program that Lewis Terman set up. I mean, it was very much, when they kind of did the initial pilot study on it, it was one of the longest longevity studies ever conducted. And it's part of the psychiatric study in human history, actually. I mean, it followed the participants in his initial group of gifted kids pretty much for their entire lives after Lewis Terman had died. It was carried on by his assistants and what have you, and followed a lot of these kids up until they were in their 80s and 90s and what have you, when they finally all died off. And I think it might even still be sort of ongoing to some extent, following some of their, their offspring. But I'm, just bringing this up because, I mean, it was very much rooted partly in the study of the genetics, how the offspring of these kids would react, and also was there a genetic basis for their high intelligence, and also would that contribute to their success, i.e. do high IQs also contribute to the kind of financial success. But I mean, this was intended as basically a straight up, eugenics program. It was basically crafting a structure of education that would use high IQ as an excuse to bring these, kids out, to give them superior educational standards than what people going through the regular classes would get. As I sort of said before, I mean, this was based on a model that, Terman and a lot of these other psychologists, or psychiatrists and psychologists like Robert Yerkes and what have you, were developing during the First World War. I mean, they did these series of tests. It was the largest psychiatric series of tests that have ever been done using a personality profile, the Stanford Binet one. And it was, done to categorize the troops into two different categories, the Army Alpha and the Army Betas. And the Betas were basically the disposable ones, the ones who could be sent to the front lines, as cannon fodder to fight in the trenches and that kind of stuff. The Alphas were the people who showed leadership abilities, who would make fine officers, or could also do other functions such as serve as medics and what have you, that required intelligence and specialized training and so forth. And this also sort of led to the rise of the notion of what is usually referred to as psychometrics, i.e. placing people who supposedly have the greatest skills at their disposal that they possess, and professions and what have you, or in the case of the Army, and areas of it where they will be of greatest use. You don't want somebody, for instance, with like a 150 IQ fighting on the trenches when you have a bunch of, let's say, African Americans, because this would have been the period in the 20s and so forth, when this kind of thinking prevailed that you could just send out there. So
right.
Anyway, so this was sort of the thinking that later went into what became our nation's education program. And, basically the sort of differences between people who are put through various kinds of gifted programs and so forth versus people who get like Common Core or whatever they're calling now the basic education that most of the public is subjected to. So there was always this process of eugenics and also probably breeding programs as well. I mean, this certainly seems to have been the case with Terman's family and some of the other stuff that was going on unofficially in the San Francisco area. But that's another subject. But yeah, I mean, some of Terman's students ended up going over to Germany in the interwar years. And I mean, who knows? Obviously we know that the Nazis did draw inspiration from some of the stuff they were doing over here in the United States, but I mean, they might have even been coached a little bit, on how to the eugenics program and whatnot. I mean, but I do think that especially with, the war breaking out, it did give them the ability to do things, that would not otherwise be possible under normal legal or ethical standards, which was obviously of interest to the United States and the Soviet Union. I mean, after the war was over with. So, I mean, this is one of the reasons why, we had interest in bringing in the Nazis. But I mean, in general, it kind of seems like with the United States, I mean, obviously, since we're supposed to be this bastion of freedom and democracy and so forth.
Right.
We couldn't do this kind of research.
It had to be Nazis that were brought over here to do it. Oh, man, that's blowing my mind, man. Thank you for that.
Or even that the Soviet Union could do directly for that matter as well. Right. And I mean, it's not necessarily just the Nazis. I mean, that we outsource this kind of stuff to. I mean, Israel. I mean, again, it's not really talked about a lot, but I mean,
sure.
South Africa, that's another big one where just, especially by the 1980s, man. I mean, I really think South Africa, frankly, was like where a lot of this stuff was kind of transferred to after, like the church committee and what have you started to blow the whistle on it here in the United States, because there was a lot of insane stuff that was going on in South Africa with like Project Coast and what have you.
Can you go into that a little bit?
Sure. Well, see, South Africa really like reoriented its national security apparatus when I think Pick Botitha or whatever his name was became don't hold me to that. I'm probably goofing up on this, but
man, you got it so much more down pat than me. I'm sounding like an idiot next to you, so I wouldn't worry about it. I'll take the heat.
But he became like the prime minister, and he did away with BOSS. What was it? The Bureau of State Security or something like that. That was basically their equivalent of the CIA, and nerfed like its successor and down to like where it really didn't have a lot of functions. And anyway, to fill the void effectively, they really built up their special operations forces. By like the 1980s, South Africa was really dominated by its special forces, and specifically the famous 32nd Battalion. And they had initiated this chemical and biological warfare program called Project Coast, which more or less eventually became under the control of their special operations forces, which is insane. I mean, more or less, this would be the equivalent of JSOC running like, the Dugway facility in Utah and, oh gosh, the one in Maryland, was it Fort Detrick? You know what I'm saying? I mean, but that was more or less like what was happening. And, in addition to like researching, actual like weaponry, they were also researching a lot of stuff that could be used for like crowd control and what have you. I mean, ketamine, for instance, and MDMA were actually researched massively as part of Project Coast. And it's an interesting thing. Like they first started to be used recreationally in a large scale in the UK in the late 1980s, where South Africa, and specifically their special operations forces, had a lot of intelligence assets based out of, in which the UK, that is to say, had the largest anti-apartheid movement in the entire world at the time. So was it a coincidence that the kids who were part of the anti-apartheid movement were suddenly being hit with all this MDMA and ketamine and going into these raves and what have you by the end of the late 1980s?
Oh, wow.
So there was that going on. But I mean, there's just so many unanswered questions, in my opinion, about this when you look at the composition of the South African Special Forces. Okay, so the 32nd Battalion, the overwhelming majority of soldiers in the 32nd Battalion were Black Africans. And not just that, but they had originally been guerrilla fighters and the 32nd Battalion was mainly involved in the Angolan conflict. That was like really the big one that South Africa was involved in. It essentially was a proxy war being fought between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, where we were using the South African forces, and the Soviet Union had, basically funded Cuba to send in tons of troops into Angola to fight with the various, Angolan resistance forces there. So they were squaring off against the South African forces, and principally just their special operations forces. And I mean, the 32nd Battalion was so elite that there was this one battle, I think it was like Cochinos or something like that. I always forget the name of it. It was in like 87 or something. It was more or less the decisive battle for this. But Cuba had amassed this joint, force with the Angolans that was like something like 20,000 troops, and the South Africans sent the 32nd Battalion like 2,000 troops. I mean, they were literally outnumbered 20-1 at various points in the battle, and they more or less mopped the floor with the Cuban forces. I mean, wow. Cuba tried to claim the victory because essentially the 32nd Battalion wasn't able to totally destroy their army, more or less.
Right.
It was just like insane. I mean, just
that's wild. I've never heard about this.
So, and again, these guys were, they had originally been fighting with the Angolan forces that they were squaring off against in this battle, and a lot of the other battles they had fought for the South Africans. And this was a whole process that the South African Special Forces had adopted from Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. That's, slightly to the north of South Africa. And that had also been like an apartheid country up until like 1980 or so. And when it folded, a lot of the special operations forces from Rhodesia, like the Silesia Scouts and the Rhodesian Special Air Services, had gone to South Africa and signed up with their, special operations forces. And it was the same thing like with the Silesia Scouts. They were mostly, Black Africans who had been part of the resistance in Rhodesia, who were turned and then ended up fighting for the apartheid regime. So this is insane. Okay. Yeah. You basically have managed to create some of the most elite fighting forces in the latter part of the Cold War that are comprised almost entirely of Black Africans fighting for white minority rule, basically. And it's never been explained how this was accomplished. Well, I mean, the official narrative is that they basically bribed them. They offered their families lots of money and what have you if they fought for them, which, that might have worked in some cases. But I mean, again, as the Soviet Union kind of learned, in its dealings with American officials, because it was assumed by the Soviets, you could easily turn American officials by offering them bribes, but that really was not that effective in a lot of cases unless somebody already had a lot of personal problems, were in debt, that kind of thing. And I just think it's kind of the same thing with this. It really just doesn't, in my mind, explain how you could have gotten these forces, to, because again, like I'm saying before, as I, try to point out with some of these earlier anecdotes about the battles these guys were fighting, they weren't in regular military forces. These guys were being sent on very dangerous missions. They were put into battles where they were outnumbered 20-1 and they were fighting their asses off. Were they just going to do that for money alone?
Yeah, right.
It does beg the question. And then on top of that, I mean, there were, another thing is that the South African forces, the special operations forces, were also researching things like neurolinguistic programming and that kind of stuff as well. So there's a lot of stuff. And I mean, also, I should point out, Rhodesian special forces also had a chemical and biological warfare program that they controlled that was then brought to South Africa. So yeah, there were just a lot of interesting things going on in that whole region right around the time MK Ultra was winding down and really, kind of played into this whole narrative for quote unquote super soldiers. and is unfolding concurrently at the same time when, we were essentially trying to, you know, reimagine, I guess you could say, our own special operations forces. Because I mean, we had the Green Berets that used them for the first time really en masse in Vietnam, and their performance was mixed, to put it mildly. So, going into the late 70s, early 80s, this is like when SEAL Team 6 was created. It was when the Delta Force was created. And then by the end of the decade, they had formally set up what became the Joint Special Operations Command. So it's also kind of unfolding around the time South Africa is doing all this crazy stuff, building up these elite special forces. And, oh gosh, then you have like the mysterious figure of Stephen Hillage, who later turned up in as a suspect in the anthrax letters in 2001. But this guy was, a former Green Beret that went to Rhodesia in the late 70s, was involved, I think, with the Seleucus Scouts or something like that, while he was in Rhodesia. And then later, ended up in South Africa working for some medical unit or something like that. And then only returned to the United States in 94 when apartheid ended. But, Soldier of Fortune magazine was being used to heavily recruit troops for the Rhodesian and, later South African forces. A lot of Americans, fought in it. So, to my mind, again, there's definitely a possibility that we were using South Africa as a testing ground to kind of build up these elite forces that have, become such a major part of our arsenal now. I mean, they're probably the only thing that, more recently has prevented Ukraine from falling to the Russians, frankly.
And so that's where you see the real deal mind control being used, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, when you look at some of this stuff, and then of course, since the 90s, I mean, a lot of this stuff was outsourced into these private military companies. I mean, in the case of obviously Executive Outcomes, for example, this is the famous private South African private military company that was sort of used as a model for the outfit Leonardo DiCaprio's characters involved with in the movie Blood Diamond. But Executive Outcomes actually inherited a lot of the troops, from the 32nd Battalion after apartheid ended. And interestingly enough, they were set up originally to, do neurolinguistic programming courses for the South African Defense Forces. And then later they became like a full-blown mercenary company. But again, they had a lot of other businesses that they owned as well. That did a variety of different projects for them. So, I mean, who knows? But I mean, I do sort of think about that with, just the structure of some of these private military companies. I mean, a company like DynCorp is involved with a ton of other things besides just, combat or security roles that we usually associate with them. I mean, they've done everything from like provide vaccines to, cut grass in the DC area and some, public buildings there and what have you. So I definitely kind of feel like, when you look at some of the stuff that's going on in Iraq and what have you, I mean, these private military companies that are owned in a lot of cases by these conglomerates that do a lot of other research, could easily be used as a means on the one hand to sort of like house and, kind of conduct things with these super soldiers, quote unquote, but I mean, also to carry out like a lot of experimentation in the field and whatnot.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll alter my premise and ask the question again. Do you think that these techniques have been turned on the public at large?
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So it's not like at first I said it's MK Ultra, but regardless of where it's.
Well, I mean, just look at stuff like, like the psychotronic stuff. I mean, this is something where, I mean, again, it's even kind of openly acknowledged, John Alexander, I mean, a Green Beret was like a big guy who was pushing a lot of this. And I mean, again, he was kind of brought back into the fold after 9/11. There's been a lot of speculation about that, but I mean, certainly, with a lot of the accounts that are coming out, first, I think from Syria, but I mean, now more recently, from the Ukraine and whatnot, and then of course other things like Havana syndrome and what have you. I mean, it does seem, pretty evident that, I mean, we've started to see more operational use of a lot of these psychotronic weapons. And I mean, again, I think a lot of this stuff is probably being carried out by special operations forces and what have you. So yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff is definitely going on right now, but I think a lot of it's just more operational now. I mean, they've already done all the experimental phases and whatnot. And now, I mean, you've got these battlefields. I mean, this is especially what disturbs me with Ukraine. I mean, God only knows all the stuff that's going to be deployed in this. And the Russians, I mean, had even kind of threatened this too when, I mean, I know everybody was making a big deal about that speech that Putin had given recently when he had, made the comment about nuclear weapons. And then I think his Secretary of State had backed it up, but the Secretary of State had also made this offhand comment about nuclear weapons and weapons based upon new technologies or something like that. So,
yeah.
I mean, I think, we're going to see more and more of this kind of stuff being rolled out. I mean, in the coming months and years, and it's really disturbing, man. I mean, and then of course, you're already seeing, I mean, the, kind of psychographic warfare that's being carried out against people online. I mean, again, when you just look at, I mean, how accurate some of these, personality modelings have become, and I mean, the ability to stimulate, I mean, people's behaviors through computer models and things like that. I mean, it makes you wonder, just with, I mean, like mass shootings, for instance. I mean, how like they seem to kind of come and go in these waves that can be suddenly like triggered. I mean, how much of this is because of the computer modeling now and the psychographic warfare that we're subjecting the public to?
Yeah, and everyone's got it in the palm of their hand, right? It's just like this. It's such a devil's bargain. It's like, here's this piece of technology in your hand that can access just more information than people have been able to access in the history that we know of, right?
Yeah.
And you get this, but it also comes with this hook.
Yeah, and I mean, it was always baked in too, because I mean, people were sort of, told the two stories about the, ARPA research where it was, this sort of like hippified version of it, and then the other where it was meant as a communication system for, the continuity of government stuff and what have you. But I mean, there was a third component too, which was basically to create a system of data mining that could be used for these computer models. I mean, this is things like
right to feed it into those models. Go ahead. Sorry.
J.C. Linklater and I mean, all the other sort of architects of the internet had realized early on and were big advocates of. So, going all the way back to the beginning, I mean, this was already being looked at through the prism of, behavioral sciences and things like that, and how we could use the data being harvested and finally have the capacity to, do these really active models or accurate models, that is to say. So from the very beginning, yeah, it was always this sort of Faustian bargain, essentially.
Yeah, and I think that kind of just is an underlying theme of technology in general. Personally, I mean, not that it's like always bad, but it does kind of come with this. It comes with a challenge, like, and I think that this is something that the ancients actually understood better than us, which is that technology must be wielded with responsibility and morality. And that's why you have things like, when you look at something like the ancient Egyptians, where their spiritual systems were as advanced as their technology. Like they understood that these things had to kind of go hand in hand, and we just don't really have that, I don't think. We go wild with it. We can't help ourselves.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it also sort of begs the question, too, when you look at a lot of the traditions of advanced technologies coming from, I mean, non-human intelligences and so forth.
Right.
So,
right. Yeah. And I'm big into that. And that's kind of the, there's the, and I know Christopher Knowles talks about this, but you hear it from multiple people, and it's, I think, in Twin Peaks, but also in The Invisibles.
mm-hmm.
The idea of Roswell being
like a ritual work.
Yeah, but like a ritual work that contacted something from outside that brought something in, right?
Yeah. Well, I think in Twin Peaks, you're
Oh,
thinking
and it's the bomb
the
in
atom
Twin
bomb.
Peaks, right? Yeah. Sorry, I missed. Yeah, you're right. But those are pretty close together, right?
Yeah. Well, no, there has definitely been speculation that they were interconnected because, I mean, they're kind of unfolding in like the same sort of geographic area and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, it does like make you wonder, but I mean, yeah, I mean, again, it kind of goes back into like the twofold nature of a lot of this because a lot of people sort of focus on things like, the Babylon working is like what it ushered in the modern UFO era. But I mean, I do think it's probably much more likely that it was stuff like the Trinity site and some of the stuff that the military was doing. I know Chris has done a lot of great work on this with some of the other projects, like what was it, like Operation Crossroads and what have you, that the military was carrying
Yeah,
out.
which is like really interesting name for. Yeah.
So, I mean, I definitely think that there were a couple of like these major like ritual workings like that were being performed like, towards the end of the Second World War into the immediate aftermath. And that was like, a good, candidate for what had produced this sort of modern UFO era that started at that point in time. Kind of plays into the whole notion that Twin Peaks had teased at that the, kind of veils between the worlds had become thinner at that point of time or something to that nature.
Well, and David Lynch is just plugged into something else. He is. And I just you can't tell me any other way. His stuff is so archetypally potent,
Mm-hmm.
Um it just seems truer than true in a lot of ways. And they
Well,
can
I
like
think
go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think more than anything, it was probably the best depiction ever that's, been done of like supernatural phenomena and stuff
Yeah.
like that. Because I mean, it really captures just like how truly weird a lot of this stuff is, I mean, that's like kind of the failings with a lot of science fiction or fantasy or horror movies is that they don't appreciate just, how strange, I mean, a lot of these
Yeah,
encounters.
how absolutely bizarre and absurd it can be. Just because I get a communication from something else doesn't mean that that's like a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of, again, begs the question with a lot of the, advances in technology and what have you. Because I mean, it's really interesting when you sort of go back to like ancient Egypt and then continuing on through a lot of like the high civilizations in that area. With Babylon, well, probably also with Samaria too. We don't know quite as much about the practices in that regard, but certainly continuing on with Greece and Neoplatonism and what have you. I mean, such a big spiritual practice among a lot of these different areas was the process of theurgy or God work, which is basically, the ascension or descension of your consciousness or a non-human consciousness through the planetary spheres and so forth. And originally, when this practice, was kind of started in Egypt, well, I mean, it might have also been practiced in Samaria and developed independently in Babylon as well. We don't really know, but I mean, it seems like
Yeah, the Chaldean or Chaldean rites.
yeah. They also did this kind of stuff too. And I mean, there were Native American tribes again, like the Hopo and the Adena, who seem to have done this practice as well. But again, essentially, it was developed initially for Pharaoh, and it was part of the, the process of the Book of the Dead. It's basically, initially it was sort of developed, as a way for the consciousness to ascend through the heavenly spheres, which was, okay, was this sort of goes into, again, a lot of the views in, the ancient world about the afterlife. A lot of people thought that the human soul originated from the Milky Way. This is, a tradition that appears in a lot of different cultures across the world. And upon death, the soul would return to the Milky Way or some other, equivalent to that. So, the Book of the Dead was basically a kind of manual for how like this process would carry out. And it would be a way for Pharaoh to practice this, before he shed his mortal coil. And then later, it was also sort of expanded on as a means of bringing down these different planetary forces. I mean, it's kind of thought that, when you see these accounts of like statues talking and that type of thing from ancient Egypt and Babylon and what have you, this is like what was actually happening. They were kind of doing this process, what we would think of now as drawing down the moon, so to speak, and pulling these planetary intelligences and stellar intelligences down into these vessels where they could communicate directly with the priesthood and so forth. And then gradually this was developed into the more, individual practice of theurgy, which became such a major component into Neoplatonism and whatnot. So, this process was ongoing throughout antiquity and, by the time of, the Gnostic sects in Alexandria and so forth, it was actually fairly widespread. And, as I had indicated before, it had developed into where, originally this was done in these very elaborate ceremonies by the priesthood. Now individual people had figured out how they could do them with like a relatively little investment of instruments or implementations. Obviously mirrors have always been a major, method for doing this with scrying and so forth. And again, it's not the, most difficult thing to procure. So it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. Sometimes the simplest things are the most effective things, and mirrors certainly have proven to be very effective at this type of stuff, especially black ones.
Well, oh yeah, definitely the obsidian mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings a lot into this side of the world too, right? With
yeah, and that was.
Go ahead.
And, well, also too, we found traces of obsidian and some of the Hopo and Adena mounds, and they also had that. What was it, Misa? I think Misa, which has been found in a lot of mounds, and that was almost surely used for the purposes of scrying. So. This is like a big process that seems to have been developed by a lot of different cultures across the world, for these kind of planetary and interstellar journeys and so forth of the consciousness, or, drawing down intelligences to, initially in the case of antiquity, it was, like I said, these inanimate objects, these statues and things of that nature. And then it became, people themselves that were drawing these beings down into them for a kind of, frankly, temporary possession, more or less.
Yeah, totally.
So, this process, like I was kind of getting at, it was very commonly practiced, throughout antiquity, in the whole area around the Mediterranean and beyond. And then, kind of gradually went underground during the advent of the Christian era. But it really started to pick up again in mass, especially in Western Europe during the Renaissance. Especially after, you had the fall of Byzantium and a lot of the Neoplatonic literature, returned initially to Italy and so forth. So, and that kind of coincides with like the rapid advancements in scientific research in the West. So, it does kind of make you wonder, when you sort of look at the presence, because again, like I was kind of alluding to, a lot of these major indigenous civilizations here in North America, again, the Hopewell civilization, was a massive trading network, that spanned all the way down from Florida to the Great Lakes. It had contact with probably the Aztecs, and
yeah,
we tend to
there's
think
a lot of similar motifs in their art too. I don't know if it's like acceptable in terms of like the current academia, but it's so similar, man.
But we tend to think of like this era as being really primitive, and it couldn't be further from it. They had a lot of massive cities and what have you, and high civilization, basically, that was, in a lot of cases built around these mounds that were, stellarly or planetarily oriented and so forth. And when a lot of that broke down, it was also when there was a lot of, civilizational regression in some of the tribes in North America specifically, whereas you still saw a lot of these high civilizations continuing like in, further south, essentially. But again, it does kind of like make you wonder, just how much of, the advancements of some of these civilizations were due to, some of these techniques and processes that have to do with ththese non-human intelligences. And if, people in high places had some of that thinking, again, this might explain why, we were putting this kind of money into things like Artichoke and MK Ultra.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting too, because listening to you talk, I just got the thought of, well, it used to be something that was reserved for the pharaohs, and it was the upper echelons, and then eventually we get to this point where it's like becomes available to the common folk. And I wonder if that's not um you're looking at that ritual actually working over a long period of time, and it's being diffused down into the masses.
Yeah. And I
And
mean,
that's kind of what gets suppressed, because then you have the suppression of the Gnostics, and then which brings us back to 1945, because the Nag Hammadi was unearthed.
I think you mean 47, I believe.
47. Okay. Yeah.
Which was
I'm
also,
sure I do.
yeah, that was, well, 47 was big with a lot of this stuff because that was the year Crowley died. It was the year
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Hammadi was discovered, the year the modern UFO era really started. I mean, there's a lot of like curious stuff that was like playing out with all of this at the same time, and that whole, that particular year. But yeah, I mean, it does make for some really heady stuff, no doubt.
Well, hell yeah, man. Talk about what you've got going on, anything to look for from you coming out, and then like plug your stuff again.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. Well, I mean, the big thing I've been working on is this Wisconsin project with a couple of my other buddies, but it had originally sort of started, as like kind of exploration of that, Highway 23 I was telling you about in Wisconsin with House on the Rock and Taliesin there. And specifically, I was really intrigued by the murders that had happened in Taliesin in 1914 involving Frank Lloyd Wright's mistress. It's really a bizarre, event that I don't think has ever really been adequately explained. But it's 7 people died in Taliesin on August 15th, 1914. It's to this day the second. Or actually, it's tied for the worst mass murder in Wisconsin history, along with the 2012 Sikh temple shootings. But anyway, it it's very strange. So the story, as it goes, is that the murders were conducted by Julian Carleton, who was the chef at Taliesin, and he was usually described as somebody from Barbados, but he was actually supposedly an African American from Alabama who had been masquerading as somebody from Barbados because, in theory, this would lead to less racism towards him or something like that. But anyway, he, was described as a genial presence at Taliesin for a good chunk of his service there, and instead, finally, towards the last couple of months, he was supposedly found standing up at night with a butcher knife, mumbling to himself. So it was decided to let him go, and he was giving his marching papers on August 15th, which happened to be a time when Frank Lloyd Wright was absent from Taliesin, along with Lloyd Wright, his oldest son. And yeah, Carleton, that is to say, decided to not go quietly into the night. So depending upon which account you go by, he either went into the residential area where Mama Cheney, Frank Lloyd Wright's mistress, was with her 2 children and murdered them with a hatchet, or he went into the dining area, locked it while the workmen were having lunch, set it on fire, and then stood outside of the burning building and waited for them to come out one by one and kill them with a hatchet. So in either case, it's like he was either killing a mother and her children with a hatchet, but the workmen were oblivious to this violence, or he was burning them alive and then killing them with a hatchet while a mother and her children were oblivious to this happening, which, again, it doesn't make a lot of sense, in my opinion. Then from there, Carleton supposedly took like hydrochloric acid or something in an attempt to kill himself after he had he had crawled into a fireproof like refrigerator or something like that. And that was how authorities found him. He didn't die, and so on and so forth. So it's again, there's a lot about this that's really sketchy. And then on top of that, as I had looked at it more, I was really struck by some of the similarities it had to the different forms of sacrificing ancient Celtic civilization. And of course, Frank Lloyd Wright was really into this. His mother's side of the family were from Wales. They had only immigrated in 1844, and there was still a big preservation of Welsh culture in their family. And that was why he had named the studio Taliesin in the first place. It was after the Welsh bard. And all of his, siblings and what have you had named their residences after, Welsh names and that kind of thing as well. So the three deities of sort of the Celtic pantheon that were most important were Isis and Tarianus and Taurus. And Isis specifically was really big into his victims either being hung from trees or hacked to death, and specifically with axes. Most of the images we found of this deity were on like ritual axes and things of that nature. Tarnus was the one who liked his victims burned alive, preferably in like wicker figures or baskets. And Titanus liked his victims drowned. So obviously, there was a lot of the hacking and the burning. So Tarianus and Isis would have been very pleased. There were no drownings, but Frank Lloyd Wright actually had put a Japanese ceremonial pond into the courtyard of Taliesin. And if you've ever, seen the Ringu films and what have you, Japan has a big tradition of spirits being trapped in water and wells and things like that. So it is interesting that a lot of these killings would have unfolded against the backdrop of this pond. So I was just really struck by that, and the fact that the bodies were like later taken, to like his sister's house that had the Welsh name as well. And Mama Cheney was put into the Wright family plot, which has like a lot of Welsh and Celtic trappings to it. And then kind of making things even stranger, Frank Lloyd Wright's son, Lloyd Wright, would go on to design a really famous house in Los Angeles, the Soden/Franklin house, which looks like a Mayan temple on the outside. And there's been some really compelling evidence put forth that one of the residents, George Hodel, was actually the killer of the Black Delilah in 1947. Again, he knew Lloyd Wright socially, and George Hodel was also pretty big into Celtic mythology as well. He actually used the Celtic solar cross as his business symbol for a lot of years. He might have studied Ogham script and things like that. So another interesting thing, there might have potentially been another highly ritualistic murder carried out in a house designed by a member of the Wright family. And there was, again, these sort of trappings of these, bizarre Celtic stuff. And anyway, this was something I became really fascinated by. And I started to wonder, were there links and were there other examples of this in Wisconsin? And it turned out that, when you started looking into Hodel, he had also been put forth as a suspect for the Zodiac killings. And another interesting candidate for that was a guy called Paul Dorr, who was involved with the Church of All World and Society for Creative Anachronisms and a lot of the neo-pagan scene in Northern California. But he also maintained a correspondence with Circle Sanctuary in their newsletter, which was based not only out of Wisconsin, but was within about 10 miles of Taliesin, out there in that whole same area of Wisconsin. And then when you sort of step back and look at Wisconsin as a state as a whole, there's a lot of other interesting things. Jeffrey Dahmer, some of his killings also have some overlap with Celtic ritual, especially the collection of like heads and skulls from his victims. And then also the smiley face killings. The most credible accounts by that have been put forth by Kevin Gannon and some of the other ex-cop and law enforcement people he works with. And they had postulated that La Crosse, Wisconsin was potentially one of the major hubs for the smiley face killings. A lot of victims have turned up within a 200-mile radius of La Crosse, which is right at the border with Minnesota, and it's not far from Iowa as well. So, a lot of victims in those states fall into the perimeter of La Crosse. And again, drownings, obviously, as I was kind of saying before, that was a big part of Celtic ritual sacrifice. So this is kind of something that we're hoping to explore in this project, and everything goes according to plan, it will hopefully turn into a kind of docu-series that we're going to do a lot of other stuff with things online and what have you to kind of flesh it out and give even more information to people. But it's, really exciting. I think it's going to be kind of almost like a full-blown transmedia project when it's finished. And hopefully it's going to give some really, novel accounts on some of these historic figures and high weirdness. And again, it's also not to try to perpetuate the sort of narrative of like an underground cult or something. That's not, necessarily what we're looking to find or prove, but also to sort of just raise the possibility to areas and affect people. Do we subconsciously play out ritual dramas because of other influences on us, which, in some cases seems to have been what was happening with some of the individuals in Wisconsin and some of the areas linked to them. So, I'm really excited about it. It's going to cover both a lot of parapolitical and a lot of high strangeness research, which are my two big passions. And then I've also got my ongoing Q book, which I'm hoping to hunker down and get a lot of work done on over the winter. It's definitely going to be 2 books now. The first book is actually going to cover a lot of the territory in Northern California, along with the history of Discordianism and a lot of that kind of stuff. Along with the history of psychotronics and, a lot of the stuff we talked about this with, psychographic warfare and computer simulations. How all this stuff came about too. And then the second book is going to kind of get into, how it sort of led to the rise of QAnon and the efforts of a lot of private military and intelligence companies like Cambridge Analytica to use these kinds of technologies. So the whole thing is definitely really ambitious. Pretty much all the projects are at this point. The Q book is already up to 200,000 words, which is why or 100,000, which is why I've had to break it up because it's just too much for one book. So yeah, a lot of big projects I'm working on, and God willing, I will hopefully have a lot of this stuff starting to come out in 2023, and it will hopefully change some discussions on a lot of topics and bring a lot of interesting information to the public at large. And in the meantime, if you're interested in hearing more of my stuff or reading it or what have you, there's obviously the VISUP blog, VISUP, VIEW, all one word, .blogspot.com. I don't update that as much now as I would like to, but there's still a lot of great articles on there. I did it pretty much regularly for 10 years. There's a ton of stuff on there, and it's got links to a lot of my other things too. I do the Farm podcast. There's a weekly free show, which you can find on Apple and Spotify under the Farm Podcast Mach 2. That's MACHII. And then also there's the Farm's Patreon. You get on the lowest tier 2 additional full-length shows per month on that. And the all-access patrons, you get the Farm's, you get those shows plus the Farm's weekly Zoom party, periodic State of the Union addresses, a lot of information on my ongoing investigations, movies that I throw together, my travels, just all kinds of goodies and what have you. So definitely consider signing up for the Farm's Patreon. It's another Farm podcast, the official Patreon there. And again, you can find links to all this stuff on the VISUP blog. So yeah, if you're not sick of me at this point, there's plenty of resources that you can find me at.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I know you've brought a lot of interesting information to light for me, and you've given me a lot more to sit with and think about. And really look forward to what you've got coming out. And just thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, sir.
All right. Have a great one.
You too, sir.
Do you experience weird shit? Do your parents not like to tell their friends about what you do in the woods? Do you make more friends in a graveyard than you do at a party populated by living humans? Do you have interactions with beings that are not strictly considered human? Do other people look at you like you're crazy when you mention talking to trees in casual conversation? If you fist pumped or even just answered yes to any of these questions, you may be a nightbird. So let's sing together. If you'd like to come on the show and flap your gums with me, share your stories, or just talk about the malleable nature of reality for a while, then send me an email at tim@nightbirdpodcast.com. That's tim@nightbirdpodcast.com. I'd love to have you on the show. But until then, I gotta fly. But before I go, let me say this. Remember, you are never alone. I believe you.